The plastic spoon scraped against metal with a sound that had become Diego's entire world. 3 days underground, and the makeshift ventilation pipe above his head was his only connection to air, to life, to hope that someone might hear him. Each scrape sent tiny vibrations through the buried shelter they'd been forced to build with their own hands. What had started as a temporary hiding place before crossing into America had become a tomb sealed with promises that were never meant to be kept. The nightmare had begun 2 weeks earlier in Guatemala City, where Diego Morales worked as a mechanic earning wages that couldn't support his diabetic mother's medication. When his cousin connected him with a smuggling operation that promised safe passage to Texas, the price seemed reasonable compared to other options. $8,000 for a journey that included several days in a secure underground facility near the Mexican border, where groups waited for optimal crossing conditions. The coordinator, a soft-spoken man who called himself Ro, had explained the process with almost scientific precision. Groups of 7 would be transported to a remote location in the desert, where they construct their own temporary shelters. These underground hideouts would protect them from Border Patrol surveillance while final arrangements were made. It sounded professional, organized, safe. The fact that they'd be building their own hiding places was presented as added security. No permanent structures for authorities to discover. Diego wasn't alone in trusting this elaborate plan. The group of 7 Guatemalans had been carefully selected from the same region, all with similar desperate circumstances. There was Elena, a teacher whose school had been closed by gang violence. The Martinez brothers, farmers whose crops had failed 3 seasons running. An older man named Joaquin who'd lost everything to hurricane damage. Maria, barely 19, trying to reach her sister in Houston. And Carlos, a construction worker whose expertise would prove crucial in ways none of them imagined. The journey north through Mexico had been surprisingly smooth. They had traveled in a legitimate cargo truck, hidden among boxes of textiles, crossing checkpoints with properly forged manifests. Raul's organization seemed to have every detail covered, every official paid, every route mapped. When they finally arrived at the designated location, a desolate stretch of Sonoran Desert 30 miles south of the border, everything appeared exactly as promised. The site looked ordinary enough during their nighttime arrival. Rolling hills of sand and scrub, broken by occasional rock formations that provided natural cover. Raul pointed to a specific area where they'd excavate their shelter, explaining how the underground chamber would be invisible from above while providing comfortable accommodation. He even showed them photos on his phone of similar hideouts that had housed dozens of successful crossings. The digging began at dawn, guided by Carlos's construction experience and Raul's specific instructions. They needed to excavate a space roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, deep enough that a person could stand upright. The sandy soil was relatively easy to move, and working together, they made steady progress. Raul provided proper tools, shovels, picks, buckets for removing dirt. Nothing suggested this was anything other than temporary construction. The design was surprisingly sophisticated. They dug the main chamber first, then smaller connecting tunnels for storage and waste. Carlos installed wooden supports using lumber Raul had provided, creating a framework that could support the weight of sand above. Most importantly, they constructed a vertical shaft that would serve as both entrance and ventilation, running from the main chamber to the surface. It was engineering born of necessity, built by people who had no choice but to trust. Elena worked alongside the men, her teacher's attention to detail, ensuring nothing was overlooked. She organized their supplies, rationed water during the hot work days, kept spirits up with quiet encouragement. The Martinez brothers brought farming knowledge about soil stability and drainage. Even 19-year-old Maria contributed, weaving grass mats that would serve as bedding. The project felt collaborative, almost hopeful. The shelter took 4 days to complete. When finished, it was genuinely impressive, a hidden underground room accessible only through a narrow shaft camouflaged at surface level. Battery-powered LED lights illuminated the space. Plastic sheeting lined the walls to prevent cave-ins. They'd even created separate areas for sleeping, cooking, and sanitation. It was crude but functional, exactly what Raul had promised. On the 5th night, Raul announced that crossing conditions were optimal, but there was a complication. The Border Patrol had increased patrols in their target area, making it dangerous to move a large group. He'd take 4 people tonight: Elena, the Martinez brothers, and Joaquin. The remaining 3, Diego, Carlos, and Maria, would follow in 2 days when surveillance decreased. They'd wait in the underground shelter, completely safe from detection. The separation felt wrong to Diego, but Raul's explanation made tactical sense. Smaller groups attracted less attention. The underground chamber could easily house 3 people for a few days. They had enough supplies, water, and battery power. Carlos agreed it was strategically sound. Maria seemed nervous but accepted the logic. They watched their friends climb into Raul's truck, disappearing into the desert night with promises of reunion in Texas. Alone in their buried sanctuary, the 3 tried to maintain normal routines. They played card by LED light, shared stories, planned what they'd do in America. Carlos talked about construction jobs in Dallas. Maria dreamed of reuniting with her sister. Diego imagined earning enough to afford his mother's insulin. The underground space felt cozy, protective, like a secret clubhouse built for adult purposes. The problems began on the second day. Their cell phones, which had worked intermittently near the surface, showed no signal from underground. When Diego climbed the ventilation shaft to check for messages, he found something that made his blood freeze. The entrance they'd used to descend had been filled with sand and carefully camouflaged. From above, there was no sign that anything had ever been disturbed. Panic set in slowly, then all at once. They'd been sealed inside their own creation, buried alive in a tomb they'd built with their own hands. The realization was so absurd, so impossible, that it took hours to fully accept. Raul hadn't just abandoned them. He deliberately trapped them underground, probably never intending to return. The shelter they'd proudly constructed had been their own grave from the beginning. Carlos, drawing on a construction experience, immediately assessed their situation. The wooden supports were solid. The chamber wasn't in danger of collapse. They had enough battery power for several more days of light. Water would last another day, maybe 2 with strict rationing. Food was already running low, but their main concern was air. The ventilation shaft that had seemed adequate for temporary use might not sustain 3 people indefinitely. They tried everything to escape. Carlos examined every inch of the chamber, looking for structural weaknesses they could exploit. They took turns digging at the sealed entrance, but the shaft was too narrow for effective excavation, and sand just fell back down faster than they could remove it. Shouting produced no response. They were too isolated, too well hidden. The very features that made their shelter invisible also made rescue impossible. As hours turned to days, the psychological pressure became overwhelming. Maria spent long periods crying, overwhelmed by the reality of their situation. Carlos threw himself into futile escape attempts, clawing at walls until his fingers bled. Diego tried to stay rational, to think of solutions, but the weight of earth above them felt increasingly oppressive. They were experiencing premature burial, a terror so primal it reduced grown adults to whimpering children. The air grew thicker as their oxygen was depleted and carbon dioxide accumulated. They began experiencing headaches, fatigue, difficulty concentrating. Sleep became elusive, partly from fear, partly from a body's instinctive recognition that sleeping might mean not waking up. They took turns staying alert, monitoring each other for signs of oxygen deprivation. On the 4th day, Maria made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring the chamber in growing desperation, she found something Carlos had dropped during construction, a metal serving spoon, probably fallen from their cooking supplies. The handle was sturdy, the edge worn but still functional. Most importantly, it was long enough to reach the ventilation pipe from below. Diego took the spoon and began the systematic work that would either save them or serve as his final act. The ventilation pipe was made of PVC, installed to bring fresh air into their shelter. If he could break through it at the surface level, create a larger opening, maybe their voices would carry. It was their only remaining connection to the world above, their last hope of making contact with anyone who might hear. The work was maddening in its tedium, scraping plastic with metal, one tiny chip at a time. The pipe was several feet above his head. so he had to work with arms extended, standing on makeshift platforms Carlos built from their supplies. Each scrape produced barely visible damage, but Diego continued with mechanical persistence. There was nothing else to do but scrape and hope and pray. Meanwhile, their condition deteriorated. The air was definitely getting worse. They were all experiencing persistent headaches, nausea, disorientation. Carlos had stopped his frantic escape attempts, conserving energy they no longer had to spare. Maria seemed to drift in and out of consciousness. They were slowly suffocating in their underground tomb, racing against time that was running out faster than air. The breakthrough came on the 5th day, though breakthrough was too generous a term. Diego's relentless scraping had finally worn to the PVC pipe at surface level, creating a hole barely larger than a quarter. But it was enough to change the air circulation slightly, and more importantly, enough to transmit sound. For the first time since being sealed underground, they could project their voices beyond their burial chamber. They took turns shouting to the tiny opening, coordinating their efforts to maximize their chances of being heard. But their location remained impossibly remote. Who would be wandering the Sonoran Desert close enough to hear? Their voices were weak from oxygen deprivation, their words probably indistinguishable from wind through the rocks. Still, they shouted because it was the only action available, the only alternative to waiting for death. Carlos was the first to collapse completely. The big construction worker who built their shelter simply stopped breathing normally, his body unable to process what little oxygen remained. Maria tried to help him, to share her water, to keep him conscious, but he was fading fast. The man who'd shown them how to support the ceiling, how to make their prison structurally sound, was dying in his own creation. Diego continued his vigil at the tiny hole, shouting until his voice gave out, then scraping more, then shouting again. His world had narrowed to this single connection point with the surface. Everything else, the chamber, his companions, his own failing body, faded into background. Only the whole mattered. Only the possibility that someone might hear, might care, might investigate strange sounds coming from apparently empty desert. The shepherd found them on the 6th day, drawn by sounds he initially mistook for injured animals. Manuel Gutierrez was checking on his small flock when he heard human voices coming from the ground itself. Following the sound led him to a barely visible hole in the sand, from which desperate voices pleaded in Spanish for help. He immediately called authorities, then began digging with his bare hands while talking to the trapped people below. The rescue took hours. Emergency responders had to carefully excavate the sealed entrance, shoring up the tunnel as they worked to prevent collapse. When they finally broke through, they found a scene that haunted the experienced rescue workers. 3 people in an underground chamber, 2 unconscious, 1 barely able to speak. Carlos had died sometime during the 5th night. Maria was comatose from oxygen deprivation. Only Diego remained conscious enough to explain what had happened. The investigation revealed the scope of the deception. Raul's organization had used this method repeatedly, promising temporary shelter while actually creating burial sites. The 4 people who'd been taken first had never been seen again, presumably murdered once they were no longer useful. The underground shelters served a dual purpose, hiding evidence and eliminating witnesses who might identify the smuggling operation to authorities. Diego spent weeks in a hospital, recovering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and the psychological trauma of premature burial. Maria survived, but with permanent brain damage from prolonged oxygen deprivation. She was transferred to a facility in Guatemala that could provide long-term care for her condition. The reunion with her sister would never happen now. Another dream buried in the desert along with everything else. The legal aftermath was complicated by jurisdiction issues. The crime had occurred in Mexico, but involved American immigration, with victims from Guatemala. Raul and his organization had vanished completely, probably operating under different names in different locations. The sophisticated network that had seemed so professional was revealed as a murder machine that industrialized the killing of desperate migrants. Other families came forward during the investigation, reporting relatives who'd paid for passage and disappeared. The underground shelters were just one method in a toolkit of murder disguised as smuggling. Some victims were shot and buried in mass graves. Others were sold to human trafficking networks. A few, like Elena and the Martinez brothers, were probably killed immediately after paying their fees. The successful crossing was just marketing to attract new victims. Diego returned to Guatemala City changed in fundamental ways. The mechanic who descended into the earth seeking a better life had emerged as something else, a witness to industrialized murder, a survivor of premature burial, a man who'd scraped his way back to life with a serving spoon. He couldn't work in enclosed spaces anymore. Basements, tunnels, even small rooms triggered panic attacks that left him gasping for air that felt perpetually insufficient. The money he'd borrowed for the journey remained a debt that followed him through his damaged life. Family members who contributed to his passage fee still expected repayment, even knowing he'd been victimized. The loan sharks who financed part of his $8,000 showed no mercy for his trauma. Survival had made him a debtor rather than success, burdened rather than freed. He became an unofficial advocate for families of the disappeared, using his experience to help others understand what might have happened to their missing relatives. The underground shelter method was just one of many ways smuggling organizations eliminated witnesses and evidence. Diego's story served as both warning and explanation, proof that some disappearances were murder rather than successful crossing. The nightmares were specific and unrelenting. He'd dream of scraping plastic with metal, of air growing thicker, of voices calling from holes in the ground. Sometimes he was still underground. Sometimes he was a rescuer trying to dig others out. Always, there was a sound of the spoon against the pipe, that rhythmic scraping that had been their lifeline and his obsession. 3 years later, Manuel Gutierrez, the shepherd who'd found them, still checked that area of desert regularly. He'd become convinced that other shelters existed, other people buried alive, other voices calling from underground graves. He'd report suspicious sounds to authorities, though investigations rarely found anything. The desert kept its secrets well, and the dead rarely made enough noise to disturb the living. Diego never attempted another border crossing. The $8,000 had bought him knowledge rather than passage. Understanding of how hope could be weaponized, how desperation could be monetized, how graves could be disguised as shelters. He'd learned that some doors, once closed, required more than money to reopen. Some crossings led not to new countries, but to buried chambers where dreams suffocated in carefully constructed tombs. The serving spoon he'd used to scrape their way to salvation became a talisman he carried everywhere. Airport security would question it. Employers would wonder about it, but he couldn't leave it behind. It represented a thin line between burial and rescue, between suffocation and survival, between being forgotten underground and being heard above. The metal bore scratches from his work against the PVC pipe, permanent marks of the most important tool he'd ever used. Sometimes people asked about his experience, drawn by news reports or word-of-mouth stories. He'd tell them about the construction phase, the pride in building something functional, the moment of realization when they discovered they'd been sealed inside. But he rarely described the scraping, the relentless work with the spoon, the way sound could travel through a hole the size of a quarter. That part belonged to him, a memory too specific for sharing. The underground chamber probably still existed, partially collapsed but fundamentally intact. Other migrants might stumble across it, might wonder about the wooden supports and plastic sheeting. Diego hoped they'd recognize it as a warning rather than an opportunity. The shelter that had nearly become his grave served now as a monument to creativity of those who turned refuge into death, safety into burial, dreams into nightmares buried 6 feet below the surface of an indifferent desert. Maria lived in an assisted care facility, her brain damage preventing her from understanding what had happened or why she was there. Her family visited when they could, but she didn't recognize them. The bright 19-year-old who'd woven grass mats and dreamed of Houston had been replaced by someone who required help with basic functions. Her sister in America eventually stopped sending money, accepting that the reunion would never happen. The investigation files remained open but inactive. New cases demanded attention. New methods required study. New victims needed identification. The underground shelter operation had been one technique among many, notable mainly for its requirement that victims dig their own graves. Law enforcement added it to their databases and training materials, another variation in the Encyclopedia of Human Cruelty applied to border crossing. Diego's mother died 2 years after his return, her diabetes finally overwhelming their ability to afford treatment. The insulin he'd hoped to buy with American wages remained forever beyond reach. He'd tried to cross a border to save her life, and instead had been buried alive while she slowly died at home. The symmetry was cruel but exact. Two people suffocating at different speeds in different kind of prisons. The plastic spoon remained in his pocket, a weight both physical and metaphorical. Sometimes he'd take it out and examine the scratches, remembering each scrape against the PVC pipe, each tiny chip of progress toward salvation. The tool that saved his life was ordinary, humble, forgotten, but in the right circumstances, with enough desperation and time, even a serving spoon could become the difference between life and death. He worked now as a watchman, guarding construction sites at night. The irony of protecting buildings while haunted by underground spaces wasn't lost on him. But surface structures felt safer, open to sky, accessible to rescue. He'd walk the perimeters, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The job paid poorly but kept him moving, kept him above ground, kept him from thinking too much about chambers buried in desert sand. The rescue workers who'd found him sometimes asked follow-up questions, trying to understand how the shelter operation worked. Diego answered their questions, but couldn't provide the strategic insights they sought. He'd been a victim, not an insider. His knowledge was limited to the experience of building his own tomb and scraping his way out of it. The larger network, the coordination, the method for selecting victims, all of that remained mysterious. On quiet nights, walking empty construction sites, Diego would think about the others who'd paid Raul's organization. How many had been buried in similar shelters? How many had scraped at pipes with improvised tools? How many had died calling for help through tiny holes no one would ever find? The desert could hide infinite graves, infinite voices, infinite stories that would never be told. The spoon clicked against his keys as he walked, a small percussion that marked his steps through the darkness. Each sound reminded him of larger sounds, of metal against plastic, of desperate scraping in buried chambers. But also reminded him of survival, of the moment when a quarter-size hole had connected him to a world that still contained shepherds who cared about strange voices coming from the ground. 3 people had entered that shelter voluntarily, proud of their construction, confident in their plan. 1 had emerged damaged, 1 had emerged broken, 1 had never emerged at all. The ratio was about average for border crossings. Diego had learned. The methods varied: desert exposure, trafficking, murder, burial, but the mathematics remained constant. Some dreams survived the journey. Most didn't. All carried costs that extended far beyond the money paid to cross imaginary lines drawn on maps by people who'd never had to scrape their way to freedom with plastic spoons. The serving spoon in his pocket was more than a tool now. It was proof that survival sometimes required the most ordinary instruments, applied with extraordinary desperation. It was evidence that graves could become rooms, that burial could become rescue, that the difference between death and life could be measured in quarter-inch holes and a persistence to create them one scratch at a time.